Thank you and good morning. As Chairman Reynolds said, I am an economist. I'm a labor economist. I know a lot more about employment and jobs than I know about how to change marriage rates and childbearing patterns. But I've read some of that literature, and I've written a little bit in that literature too. And so I want to make a couple of points about that and try to have a sort of a broader view about why trends have gone this way. Let me start with a point. It seems to me that all the speakers so far have taken for granted that single parenthood has a really negative effect on young people growing up in that families. And I'm not going to here to disagree with that point, but I think we need to be a little more subtle in our discussion of that fact. How many of you here have ever suffered through a statistics class of some kind in college or something? Okay, if you have, you've probably heard your professor say correlation does not prove causation. It's a very important point. We know that bad outcomes for young people are highly correlated with growing up in a single-parent family, and we know that very large fractions of black children grow up that way. That does not prove that the single parenthood is causing causation. So it remains a statistical question. Well, how do you sort those things out? How do you disentangle? Because, frankly, these young people bring many other deficits with them in their personal lives and face many other structural barriers. And so can we disentangle what piece is really caused by single parenthood as opposed to other problems? It turns out it's surprisingly difficult to do that. And after decades of people trying to do that, it's surprisingly mushy how hard it is to really identify causal effects. My own view of this literature is some piece of it really is causal, but it's much smaller than the overall correlation suggests. I'll cite one well-known study by Arlene Geronimus and Sandy Kornman in the Quarterly Journal of Economics. They did an interesting study. They compared sisters that grew up in the same families, low-income families, compared the sister who had a teen pregnancy and a child versus the one who didn't, where everything else about family background is held constant. It turns out that the sisters who didn't get pregnant do a little better than the sister who did, but not that much better. The differences are not as large as you would expect because they come from low-income families with many other barriers and many other challenges, and it's those things, as well as the single parenthood, that contributes to their problems. So again, my point here is not that family structure doesn't matter. It does. But we have to think about it broadly and interacting with a broader range of challenges if we're going to have any hope of turning this around. That's my first point. My second point is, okay, if you believe this is a bad trend and a bad development, what explains it? And people talk a lot about culture. And again, as an economist, I have real trouble with culture because I don't really know what that means. And I certainly don't know how to measure it or test it. If you talk about attitudes and behavioral norms, I do have some sense of what that means. And those clearly matter. But where do they come from? They don't exist in a vacuum. And is it all of a sudden that people just kind of went crazy in the 60s or were other things going, and maybe they did, but other things are going on as well. And here I'm actually, my views are very consistent with what Professor Patterson said on the previous panel, consistent with Daniel Patrick Moynihan, consistent with William Julius Wilson and a large body of evidence. I think the economic changes and the cultural factors interact very importantly. The civil rights era, which is an era of rising expectations, has coincided with very dramatic changes in labor markets. And the truth is, good jobs have been disappearing for less educated men. Good paying jobs have been disappearing for less educated men for almost the entire civil rights era. And it has hit all less educated men. You see it for white men, you see it for Latino men, but it has hit less educated black men very hard. They were more dependent on those jobs in durable manufacturing in the Midwestern cities, on unionized jobs, on the whole range of good-paying blue-collar jobs that have either completely disappeared or now may exist but pay a lot less than they used to. And there's a whole literature analyzing why that's occurred. Technological change, globalization, the weakening of the institutions that have traditionally protected less educated workers. All of those things together have killed off those jobs, and black men have been hit very hard by that. The jobs they needed to disappeared, and then their attempts to adapt to this new labor market are hampered by a whole variety of challenges, starting with the achievement gap that we know about. And by the way, the achievement gap, attempts to explain that, seems to be heavily correlated with going to racially segregated schools and living in racially segregated neighborhoods. Not impossible to turn those schools around, but it's more challenging to have good teachers, good administrators work in those schools and we can talk about what that literature says. But once you get to the labor market, there is still discrimination. There is spatial mismatch with people living in one place and the jobs migrating to a very different place in the metro area. There is a breakdown of informal networks that traditionally have connected people to good jobs. As these young boys growing up in these families see so many of the older males in their families, their brothers, their cousins, their fathers, disappearing completely from the labor market and from their neighborhoods and from their lives, those networks that traditionally have connected people to the labor market are gone. And one other thing I want to say this, and this I think the left takes some responsibility for this. In this country, we have denigrated high-quality career and technical education. Voc Ed, in its traditional form, was not very good, not very well connected to the labor market, and you can understand why people were concerned about tracking. Why do the white middle-class kids get to go to college while the minority kids and lower-income kids have to go to Voc Ed? But in fact, we have good, high-quality academic versions of career and technical education, starting with the career academies. If you've never heard of career academies, look closely at the evaluation evidence. They are stunning. And they don't preclude going on to college. Kids can go to career academies, but they widen the range of options. They give people options to good, high-quality, middle-skill jobs in the labor market that pay quite well and that would expand opportunity. My view is, so many of these young people who have grown up in these families, they have lost hope because they don't perceive opportunity for themselves to make it in the labor market. And when people lose that kind of hope, that's very fertile soil for all these other behaviors to develop. And there's a whole process, I think, that occurs, not only of people withdrawing from school and from the labor market, but withdrawing from a whole set of mainstream behaviors and institutions, like marriage and like living within the law. And you see this whole pattern of high school dropout rates, deterioration in labor force participation, along with the rise in incarceration and the rise of single fatherhood, and of course the rise that means of being identified as a non-custodial parent with a large child support order. You all know the statistic, 1/3 of all young black men end up incarcerated. Among high school dropouts, that number is actually 2/3. So it's a stunning number. If you're a young black male in this country and you're a high school dropout, the odds are 2 to 1 you will end up in prison. And most likely, most of those men are non-custodial dads. They're in arrears on their child support. And if you come out of prison with a criminal record and you're in arrears, which means your earnings get taxed at a very high rate, it's almost impossible to reconnect to the labor market in any serious way. So what does this mean? I think I have about 2 minutes left. What does this mean for policy? And again, I don't know how to change marriage rates and childbearing rates, but I do know something about education and employment. And I think it starts with creating the perception and the reality that there is opportunity for these young people in the education system and in the labor market. So number one, we start with educational opportunity. We heard a lot about Harlem Children's Zone and the KIPP Academies. I like all of those programs. We have no idea if we can scale those up and replicate them. So we have to start first with more evaluation to see. But more broadly, we need efforts to improve the quality of teaching and the quality of curricula in segregated lower-income neighborhoods, and we need to broaden that and bring back high-quality career and technical education so people have a range of options into the post-secondary world and into the labor market. There's efforts to prevent disconnection along all the dimensions that we talk about that need bolstering. We used to have employment and training programs for young people in those countries, and those have shriveled to almost nothing in the federal budget. Now, the truth is, if you look at the evaluation evidence, not all of them were very good or very successful, but some of them were. And we need to rebuild our education and workforce systems. They can't continue to exist as two separate systems and bureaucracies, with the educational silos over here, the labor market silos over here, never connecting. We need secondary schools, post-secondary schools working within a system of workforce development so that young people see the job opportunities that do exist out there if they complete a program of appropriate study and appropriate skill building. We need to continue efforts to reduce teen pregnancy and incarceration, but quite frankly, we need policies that throw fewer young men in the slammer. One of them, by the way, reducing the disparity in how we treat crack cocaine versus powder is a good start in that direction. There's other things about changing the parole system, locking up fewer of these young men for technical violation, because that so badly scars them in terms of their future opportunities. But finally, some men are going to go that route. Some men are going to become offenders. Some men are going to become non-custodial dads. There are reforms in the criminal justice system, in the child support system, that could improve their opportunities. We need to help them reconnect to society when they leave prison, not put additional barriers in their place, as the current child support system and the criminal justice system often does. We need to raise their incentives to take even low-wage jobs. I'll close with one last thing. The earned income tax credit, which has been so successful at subsidizing low-income moms who go into the labor market and take low-wage jobs, we need a similar thing extended to non-custodial dads and childless adults so that they face a better set of incentives as well as opportunities to do the right thing, connect to the labor market, and then take more responsibility for the children they father. Thank you.